You're standing in a room filled with people whose opinions matter to you. Your boss, your colleagues, your friends, your family. All watching, all judging. You feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on your shoulders like a heavy cloak. Every word you speak, every decision you make, every breath you take is measured against their approval. You smile when you want to scream. You agree when you want to rebel. You conform when your soul begs to break free. Now imagine something far more terrifying. Their approval begins to slip away. One by one, those nodding heads start shaking. Those encouraging smiles fade into frowns of disapproval. The warmth in their eyes turns cold, distant, judgmental. What happens to you in that moment? What primal force awakens within your chest as you feel their acceptance dissolving like smoke? You don't just feel disappointed. You don't merely experience sadness. Something far more primitive and powerful surges through your veins. Raw, unfiltered fear. Fear of rejection so intense it can drive you to desperate measures. Fear so consuming it can transform a reasonable person into someone capable of manipulation tactics they never thought themselves capable of wielding. This is the moment when approval seeking becomes a dangerous game, and you discover a truth that Machiavelli understood centuries ago. When people feel their social standing threatened, they don't become more honest, they become more cunning. They don't retreat into authentic self-expression, they advance into strategic deception. The psychology of power isn't just about those who rule nations. It's about the power dynamics that govern every human interaction, every relationship, every moment when your sense of worth hangs in the balance of someone else's opinion. But here's what makes this revelation truly unsettling. You've been living this reality your entire life without recognizing it. Every time you've shaped your words to please rather than to express truth, every time you've suppressed your authentic thoughts to maintain harmony, every time you've chosen the safe path over the honest one, you've been engaging in a subtle form of political manipulation, not of nations, but of the delicate social contracts that define your existence. The fear of losing approval doesn't just change what you say, it fundamentally rewires how you think. It transforms your mind into a calculating instrument, constantly assessing risk, constantly measuring the potential cost of authenticity against the guaranteed safety of conformity. Your emotional intelligence becomes weaponized, not for genuine connection, but for self-preservation disguised as social harmony. Yet most people never recognize this transformation within themselves. They believe they're being kind, diplomatic, considerate. They convince themselves that their careful word choices and strategic silences represent personal development rather than emotional imprisonment. They mistake their fear-driven compliance for wisdom, their approval-seeking behaviors for social grace. The most chilling aspect of this dynamic isn't that it exists, it's that it's invisible to those trapped within it. You can spend years, even decades, believing you're living authentically while actually performing an elaborate dance of deception designed to maintain the illusion of acceptance. Your leadership insights become contaminated by the need to please. Your decision-making process becomes corrupted by the terror of disapproval. This isn't simply about being liked or disliked. This cuts deeper into the very foundation of human consciousness, into the core question of whether you can exist as your true self in a world that demands conformity. It challenges everything you believe about courage, integrity, and the price of belonging. What if the very thing you think protects you, your careful attention to others' approval, is actually the source of your deepest suffering? What if your fear of rejection has become the architect of a prison so sophisticated that you've mistaken its walls for home? The answer to these questions lies buried in insights that challenge everything you thought you knew about power, fear, and the human condition itself. The roots of this psychological prison stretch deeper than you might imagine, winding their way through the very architecture of human consciousness. What you experience as a simple desire for acceptance is actually the manifestation of an ancient survival mechanism that has outlived its usefulness and now terrorizes you in ways your ancestors never anticipated. Think about it. Your fear of rejection isn't just an emotional response. It's a biological alarm system inherited from ancestors who understood that social exile meant death. When the tribe cast you out 10,000 years ago, you faced starvation, predators, and the brutal indifference of nature. Your brain learned to treat disapproval as a literal threat to existence, and that same neural circuitry still fires today when your boss frowns at your presentation or your friends question your choices. But here's where the story becomes truly disturbing. Modern society has weaponized this ancient fear against you. Contemporary politics thrives on your terror of being judged, your desperate need to align with the approved narrative. Social media platforms have turned your approval-seeking behaviors into profit margins, feeding you dopamine hits when you conform and anxiety when you dare to think differently. You've become a participant in your own psychological manipulation without even realizing it. The psychology of power that Machiavelli described in his analysis of governance and public perception operates at every level of human interaction. You don't need a crown or a castle to understand political power dynamics. You experience them every time you moderate your opinions in a group chat, every time you laugh at jokes that don't amuse you, every time you present a sanitized version of yourself to avoid confrontation. This creates what we might call the authenticity trap. The more desperately you seek approval, the less authentic you become. The less authentic you become, the more fragile your sense of self grows. The more fragile your sense of self becomes, the more desperately you seek approval. It's a psychological death spiral disguised as social adaptation. Your mind develops increasingly sophisticated strategies to navigate this treacherous landscape. You learn to read micro-expressions, to detect shifts in tone, to anticipate what others want to hear before they even know they want to hear it. Your emotional intelligence becomes a survival tool rather than a connection tool. You become fluent in the language of strategic decision-making, always calculating the social cost of honesty against the psychological cost of pretense. The most devastating aspect of this dynamic is how it corrupts your relationship with truth itself. When your survival depends on saying what others want to hear, truth becomes a luxury you can't afford. You begin to lose the ability to distinguish between what you actually believe and what you've learned to perform. Your thoughts become contaminated by the constant question, is this acceptable to think? This psychological conditioning runs so deep that most people never recognize they're trapped within it. They believe their careful self-editing represents wisdom. They mistake their fear-driven compliance for kindness. They convince themselves that suppressing their authentic voice is a noble sacrifice for social harmony. They've internalized their oppression so completely that they defend it as virtue. The cruel irony is that this strategy, this desperate attempt to secure belonging through approval seeking, actually guarantees the very isolation it seeks to prevent. When you present a false version of yourself to the world, even the acceptance you receive feels hollow because you know it's not really you being accepted. The approval becomes meaningless because it's directed toward a character you're performing rather than the person you actually are. Your leadership and fear become inextricably linked. You lead not from authentic vision but from calculated assessment of what will be received favorably. Your decisions emerge not from inner wisdom but from external validation. You become a leader who follows, a speaker who echoes, an individual who disappears into the collective demand for conformity. The historical political analysis Machiavelli provided reveals a universal truth. Power corrupts not just those who wield it officially, but anyone who becomes addicted to the approval of others. The corruption is subtle, almost invisible, but it transforms you into someone who will sacrifice truth for acceptance, authenticity for applause, integrity for inclusion. What's most disturbing is how this system operates through what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement, the most addictive form of conditioning known to science. Sometimes your performance earns approval, sometimes it doesn't, and this unpredictability creates a psychological dependency stronger than any drug. You become a gambling addict, but instead of betting money, you're betting your soul on the hope that the next act of self-betrayal will finally earn you the acceptance you crave. The manipulation tactics you unconsciously deploy become increasingly sophisticated. You learn to mirror others' energy, to reflect their values back to them, to become a human chameleon that shifts colors based on the environment. This isn't conscious deception, it's unconscious survival strategy that operates below the radar of your awareness. Yet the most disturbing realization is still to come. This entire system of approval-seeking and fear-driven behavior isn't just a personal problem. It's the foundation upon which entire societies build their illusions of stability. Your individual terror of rejection feeds into collective systems of control that depend on your compliance, your silence, your willingness to suppress inconvenient truths for the sake of social peace. The question that emerges from this recognition cuts to the core of human existence. If you can't be yourself and you can't belong without sacrificing yourself, then what does belonging actually mean? What is acceptance worth if it requires the death of your authentic voice? The true horror of approval addiction reveals itself not in dramatic moments of crisis, but in the slow, silent erosion of everything that makes you distinctly human. While you're focused on managing others' perceptions, something far more devastating is happening beneath the surface of your consciousness. You're disappearing. Consider the cognitive bias known as preference falsification. You've likely experienced this countless times without recognizing it. You're in a meeting where everyone nods in agreement with a decision you privately know is wrong. You remain silent, telling yourself you're being diplomatic, professional, wise. But each instance of suppressing your authentic response creates a small fracture in your psychological integrity. These fractures accumulate over time, eventually creating a fault line that runs through the center of your identity. Your brain, desperate to resolve the tension between what you think and what you express, begins to engage in sophisticated self-deception. It becomes easier to convince yourself that you actually agree with the group than to face the reality that you're living in constant betrayal of your own judgment. This neurological adaptation, this rewiring of your thought patterns to match your behavior, represents one of the most subtle forms of self-destruction imaginable. The Machiavellian theory you're unconsciously implementing extends far beyond political manipulation. It seeps into your intimate relationships, your parenting, your friendships, your professional interactions. You become someone who says, "I love you," when you mean, "I need you." You express enthusiasm for activities that bore you. You laugh at humor that disgusts you. You become a master of emotional counterfeit, manufacturing feelings to match expectations rather than expressing what actually exists within you. This performance becomes so automatic that you lose access to your authentic emotional responses. When someone asks what you want, you instinctively scan their face for clues about what they want you to want. When faced with a decision, your first impulse isn't to consult your values or desires, it's to calculate which choice will generate the least disapproval. Your internal compass becomes so corrupted by external magnetic fields that you forget which direction is true north. The consequences ripple outward in ways you never anticipated. Your children learn not to trust their own instincts because they watch you consistently betray yours. Your friends develop relationships with the character you perform rather than the person you are, leaving you feeling isolated even in company. Your colleagues see you as reliable but not innovative, pleasant but not inspiring, safe but not transformational. Perhaps most devastating is what happens to your strategic decision-making capacity under these conditions. Rational choice becomes impossible when your primary criterion for selection is avoiding disapproval rather than pursuing what's right, true, or beneficial. You find yourself trapped in jobs that drain your soul because leaving might disappoint others. You remain in relationships that suffocate your growth because ending them might create conflict. You avoid pursuing dreams that excite you because they might seem unrealistic to people whose opinions you've elevated above your own aspirations. The political power dynamics at play here extend into every corner of your existence. Your family becomes a small government where disapproval functions as punishment and approval as reward. Your workplace transforms into a miniature nation-state where your career advancement depends on your willingness to suppress inconvenient truths. Your social circles become echo chambers where original thought is discouraged through the subtle but effective mechanism of social rejection. Your body begins to register the toll of this constant performance. Chronic stress becomes your baseline as your nervous system remains perpetually activated by the threat of social disapproval. Your immune system weakens under the strain of maintaining psychological coherence while living in fundamental dishonesty. Sleep becomes elusive because your subconscious mind struggles to integrate the gap between who you are and who you pretend to be. The manipulation tactics become increasingly sophisticated as you develop what might be called anticipatory compliance, modifying your thoughts and feelings before anyone even asks you to. You become your own thought police, monitoring and censoring your internal experience to ensure it aligns with what you believe others expect. This creates a psychological surveillance state where you're simultaneously the watcher and the watched. Your creativity withers under these conditions because creative expression requires the willingness to reveal something unique, something that might not be immediately understood or accepted. Your capacity for genuine intimacy atrophies because intimacy demands the courage to show up authentically, with all your flaws and contradictions exposed. Your ability to experience joy diminishes because joy often emerges from moments of authentic self-expression that approval addiction makes impossible. The most cruel aspect of this deterioration is that it's largely invisible to both you and those around you. Unlike physical illness, Psychological fragmentation doesn't manifest in obvious symptoms. You can be dying inside while appearing perfectly functional on the outside. You can be losing your essential self while being praised for your adaptability and social grace. Personal development becomes impossible under these conditions because you can't develop what you're not allowed to acknowledge exists. How can you grow into your authentic self when you've spent years systematically denying that authentic self access to consciousness? How can you build self-respect when every significant decision is made based on what others will think rather than what you actually value? The historical political analysis of how leaders maintain control over populations through fear becomes a mirror for understanding how you maintain control over yourself through the same mechanism. You become both the ruler and the ruled, both the oppressor and the oppressed, both the prison guard and the prisoner in a psychological system so sophisticated that you defend it as freedom. The question that haunts this recognition is whether you've become so identified with your performance that you've forgotten there's a real person underneath the act. Have you disappeared so completely into your approval-seeking persona that returning to authenticity feels like becoming someone else entirely? The path to liberation begins with a recognition so profound it can shatter your understanding of reality. The very people whose approval you desperately seek are likely trapped in the same psychological prison you've been trying to escape. They're performing for someone else's approval just as frantically as you're performing for theirs. The entire system is built on a foundation of mutual deception, a house of cards where everyone is simultaneously holding up the structure and being crushed by its weight. This revelation unlocks the first key to your freedom. The approval you're chasing is often worthless because it's being offered by people who've lost touch with their own authentic judgment. When someone who can't be honest with themselves offers you validation, what exactly are you receiving? You've been desperately seeking the good opinion of people who don't even know their own minds. The rebellion against this system requires what we might call strategic authenticity. This isn't about suddenly becoming brutally honest in every situation. That would be psychological suicide in a world built on mutual pretense. Instead, it's about beginning to make small, calculated moves toward truth in low-risk situations. You start by expressing genuine preferences about trivial matters. You admit when you don't understand something instead of nodding along. You say, "I need to think about that," instead of immediately agreeing to requests that feel wrong. Each act of authentic expression becomes a small victory against the tyranny of approval addiction. Your nervous system begins to learn that disapproval isn't death. Your brain starts to develop new neural pathways that prioritize inner truth over external validation. You discover that most people respect honesty more than they punish it, and those who punish honesty reveal themselves as people whose opinions shouldn't matter to you anyway. The Machiavelli insights that once seemed to support manipulation tactics can be repurposed for liberation. Machiavelli understood that fear makes people controllable, but he also understood that courage makes people free. When you stop being afraid of disapproval, you stop being controllable by those who would use your fear against you. Your leadership and fear transform from a limiting partnership into a liberating separation. Personal development, you discover, isn't about becoming someone others will approve of, it's about becoming someone you can respect. This shift in focus changes everything. Instead of asking, "What will make them like me?" you begin asking, "What will make me proud of myself?" Instead of measuring your worth by external validation, you start measuring it by internal integrity. The most counterintuitive aspect of this transformation is that authentic people often receive more approval than approval seekers. Authenticity is magnetic because it's rare. In a world full of performers, someone who's genuinely themselves stands out like a lighthouse in the fog. People are drawn to authenticity because it gives them permission to be authentic too. Your courage to be real becomes an invitation for others to drop their masks. But here's where the journey becomes truly challenging. As you begin to live more authentically, you'll discover that some relationships can't survive your transformation. People who are attracted to your performative self may feel threatened by your authentic self. Friendships built on mutual pretense may crumble when one person stops pretending. Family dynamics that depend on your compliance may become strained when you start setting boundaries. This is where your emotional intelligence becomes genuinely powerful rather than strategically manipulative. You learn to distinguish between relationships that can evolve to embrace your authenticity and relationships that require your self-betrayal to survive. You develop the wisdom to know when to fight for understanding and when to accept that some connections must end for your psychological health. The contemporary politics of authenticity reveals itself as a battlefield where conformity and individuality wage constant war. But you begin to realize that the most radical political act isn't protesting in the streets or arguing on social media. It's refusing to betray yourself for the comfort of others. It's choosing truth over peace, integrity over inclusion, self-respect over social approval. Your strategic decision-making process undergoes a complete transformation. Instead of asking, "What will others think?" you start asking, "What do I actually think?" Instead of "What's the safe choice?" you ask, "What's the right choice?" Instead of "What will minimize conflict?" you ask, "What will maximize my integrity?" These new questions lead to different answers, different choices, different outcomes. The psychology of power that once enslaved you now serves your liberation. You understand that real power isn't the ability to make others like you, it's the ability to like yourself regardless of others' opinions. You realize that true influence comes not from being agreeable, but from being trustworthy. People trust those who have integrity, even when they disagree with their positions. You begin to see that fear of rejection was never protecting you from anything real, it was protecting you from discovering something extraordinary. You don't need everyone's approval to live a meaningful life. You don't need to be universally liked to be deeply valued by the people who matter. You don't need to sacrifice your authenticity to secure belonging. You need to find belonging among people who value authenticity. The rebellion isn't about becoming selfish or inconsiderate, it's about becoming honest and courageous. It's about trading the false security of performance for the real security of self-respect. It's about discovering that the person you've been hiding from the world is exactly the person the world needs you to be. This recognition births a new kind of confidence. Not the brittle confidence of someone who needs external validation, but the quiet strength of someone who knows their own worth independent of others' opinions. You become dangerous to systems that depend on your compliance and invaluable to people who cherish your genuineness. The rebellion isn't complete, but the foundation for freedom has been laid. What remains is the most difficult and most liberating step of all. The ultimate truth that emerges from this journey of liberation is both shocking and beautiful. The very thing you thought would destroy you, living authentically despite disapproval, is actually the only thing that can truly save you. Everything you were taught about the necessity of approval was a lie designed to keep you small, manageable, and controllable. But here's the revelation that changes everything. Authentic people don't just survive social rejection, they transcend it entirely. They operate from such a deep well of self-respect and inner knowing that external disapproval becomes irrelevant noise rather than existential threat. They've discovered what Machiavelli knew but rarely articulated. True power comes not from the ability to control others, but from the inability of others to control you. When you finally break free from approval addiction, you don't just change your own life. You become a catalyst for awakening in others. Your courage to be real gives others permission to question their own performances. Your refusal to participate in mutual deception forces others to confront their own authenticity. You become what the world desperately needs, a living example that it's possible to be yourself and not only survive, but thrive. The psychology of power reveals its deepest secret. Those who seek to control others are invariably controlled by their own fears. Dictators live in terror of losing control. Those who use manipulation tactics are slaves to their own strategic schemes. People who derive their power from others' approval are actually the most powerless of all, because their strength depends entirely on external sources they cannot control. But you, having learned to generate your own approval, having developed the courage to face disapproval, having cultivated the strength to stand alone when necessary, you have accessed a form of power that cannot be taken from you. It's the power of someone who belongs to themselves first and offers that authentic self to the world as a gift rather than a desperate bid for acceptance. This transformation doesn't make you indifferent to others, it makes you genuinely loving in ways that approval-seeking never could. When you're not desperately trying to extract validation from people, you can actually see them clearly. When you're not performing for their approval, you can respond to their authentic needs. When you're not afraid of their rejection, you can offer them the gift of honest feedback, genuine support, and real intimacy. The historical political analysis of power structures reveals that the most transformational leaders throughout history were people who refused to be controlled by the need for approval. They were willing to be misunderstood, criticized, rejected, and even vilified for their commitment to what they believed was true and right. Their leadership insights came not from reading the crowd, but from reading their own conscience. Your journey from approval addiction to authentic living mirrors the journey of humanity itself. Every generation must choose between the safety of conformity and the risk of growth. Every individual must decide whether to live as an echo of others' expectations or as an original voice contributing something unique to the human conversation. The governance and public perception dynamics that shape societies are just magnifications of the dynamics that shape individual lives. When people learn to think for themselves rather than simply absorbing approved opinions, democracies become more vibrant. When individuals develop the courage to question authority rather than blindly obeying it, societies become more just. When humans prioritize truth over comfort, civilizations advance. The fear of rejection that once ruled your life revealed itself as the ultimate fraud. It promised protection but delivered imprisonment. It claimed to offer safety but created constant danger. It masqueraded as wisdom while actually being the source of your deepest foolishness. Breaking free from this deception isn't just personal development. It's a revolutionary act that challenges the entire structure of how human societies organize themselves around mutual pretense. But perhaps the most beautiful aspect of this awakening is what happens to your capacity for connection. Relationships based on mutual authenticity possess a depth and richness that performed relationships can never achieve. Love between people who know and accept each other's true selves creates a sanctuary from the world's demands for pretense. Friendships built on genuine compatibility rather than strategic alliance become sources of strength rather than drain. You discover that the fear of being alone that drove your approval seeking was based on a false premise. You were never going to be alone. You were going to be alone with your authentic self, which is entirely different. The person you actually are is worth knowing, worth being with, worth defending against the world's attempts to remake you in its image. The contemporary politics that once seemed so complex and overwhelming now reveals itself as a simple choice between authenticity and performance on a massive scale. Political power dynamics become transparent when you understand that they're built on the same approval-seeking mechanisms that once controlled your personal life. Politicians who desperately need approval become predictable. Leaders who operate from authentic conviction become transformational. Your emotional intelligence, once weaponized for survival, now becomes a tool for genuine connection and understanding. You can read people's emotions not to manipulate them, but to empathize with them. You can understand their needs not to exploit them, but to serve them genuinely. You can see through their performances not to judge them, but to connect with the authentic person hiding underneath. The strategic decision-making that once served your fear now serves your values. Every choice becomes an opportunity to align more closely with who you actually are rather than who others want you to be. Every decision becomes a declaration of your commitment to truth over convenience, integrity over acceptance, authenticity over approval. The philosophy applied to politics that Machiavelli pioneered takes on new meaning when you realize that the most important government is the one you exercise over yourself. The most crucial political victory is the one where you refuse to be ruled by others' opinions. The most significant revolution is the one where you overthrow the tyranny of approval addiction in your own consciousness. The final realization that crowns this entire journey is the recognition that you never needed anyone's permission to be yourself. The approval you sought was always yours to give. The acceptance you craved was always available from the person whose opinion matters most, you. The belonging you desperately pursued was always possible in the relationship with yourself that you'd abandoned in your frantic search for external validation. Standing in this truth, you become simultaneously the most independent and the most connected person you've ever been. Independent because your worth doesn't depend on others' opinions, and connected because you can finally offer others the gift of your genuine presence rather than your desperate performance. This is the ultimate act of rebellion. Choosing to be magnificently, unapologetically, courageously yourself in a world that profits from your pretense. This is the final victory. Discovering that the person you always were is exactly the person the world needs you to be. You realize that approval was never the goal. It was the obstacle preventing you from accessing something infinitely more valuable. The unshakable peace that comes from knowing you are living in complete alignment with your deepest truth. This is not the end of your journey. It's the beginning of your life as a free human being.